The Kremlin is currently walking the most dangerous diplomatic tightrope in the modern era. Russia is simultaneously acting as a critical intelligence partner for Iran, a primary beneficiary of the skyrocketing oil prices caused by the war, and a self-appointed mediator between Tehran and Washington. It is a configuration that seems inherently contradictory. How can you feed the fire while simultaneously claiming to be the lead firefighter? This matters because Russia is the only global actor with an open, functioning line of communication to all sides of this standoff. If Moscow shifts its support, the conflict either collapses into a manageable, albeit fragile peace, or explodes into a total, unchecked regional catastrophe. The question that defines this week is not whether Russia wants this war to end, but whether it can actually afford for it to end at all. To understand this, we must look at the strategic dividend of the 2026 Iran conflict. For Moscow, this war has functioned as a massive, unintended economic stimulus. As tensions in the Strait of Hormuz choked off regional energy supplies, the price of Urals crude surged, effectively doubling Russia's monthly oil revenues compared to the previous year. This revenue has been the lifeline for a Russian domestic budget that was severely strained by the prolonged war in Ukraine. The system exists in a state of profitable instability. Russia isn't just watching the war, it is monetizing the systemic disruption of the global energy market, while simultaneously using the regional fire to distract the United States from its long-term strategic commitments in Eastern Europe. We arrived at this point through a calculated, patient evolution of the Russia-Iran partnership. Since the start of the conflict on February 28, 2026, the relationship has shifted from basic commodity trade to high-level technical coordination. Moscow has been providing Tehran with real-time satellite imagery and signals intelligence, allowing Iranian forces to track U.S. naval and military movements with lethal precision. This intelligence sharing has been the invisible hand guiding Iranian responses, making them harder to intercept and more damaging to U.S. radar and defense systems. This is not merely a friendship. It is a force multiplier that allows Iran to sustain its defensive posture without requiring Russia to commit a single soldier to the theater of war. The mechanism of Russian influence is what analysts call asymmetric mediation. It relies on the Kremlin's unique ability to act as a back-channel for information that cannot be shared through official, high-visibility diplomatic corridors. By positioning itself as the only honest broker capable of cooling tempers in Tehran, Moscow gains a permanent seat at the table in any future settlement negotiation. However, this leverage is inherently finite. The more Moscow supports Iranian offensive capabilities, the more it creates an undeniable credibility gap with the West. The United States is increasingly aware of the satellite data transfers and the drone technology exchanges, which makes the prospect of Russia acting as a neutral mediator appear increasingly cynical and untrustworthy to Washington policymakers. The consequences of this strategy are now rippling through the global balance of power. For the United States, the consequence is a conflict that is rapidly depleting its munition stockpiles and burning through political capital, all while Russian intelligence effectively turns American bases into high-value targets. For transnational corporations, this means the risk of secondary sanctions or sudden localized instability is making long-term energy investment virtually impossible, driving up the cost of living for ordinary people globally. In the long term, Russia's attempt to play both sides is damaging its standing as a stable, predictable global broker. It is increasingly seen not as a bridge builder, but as an opportunistic scavenger, profiting from a fire it is actively helping to fuel. A common persistent misunderstanding is the idea that Russia's refusal to engage in direct combat indicates a lack of commitment to the Iran alliance. In reality, Russia's strategic restraint is its most valuable asset. By avoiding direct kinetic involvement, President Putin preserves the ability to talk to Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and Washington, whereas a direct conflict would force Moscow into a binary choice it cannot sustain. Most people assume that if the war intensifies, Russia will be forced to choose a side. But Moscow's incentive structure is designed precisely to avoid that binary for as long as possible, keeping the conflict in a Goldilocks zone. Too hot for the U.S. to focus entirely on Ukraine, but not hot enough to trigger a direct, catastrophic NATO-Russia confrontation. This brings us to the shadow logistics of the alliance. Beyond mere data, there is the infrastructure of survival. Iran, under intense blockade, relies on Russian-facilitated dark pool shipping, where Russian tankers mask the origin of oil and transport critical components through non-aligned ports. This system allows Iran to maintain a trickle of revenue that prevents a total state collapse. If Russia were to withdraw this lifeline, the regime in Tehran would lose its ability to pay for the very war it is currently waging. Therefore, Moscow's mediation is not just diplomatic, it is economic life support. By keeping the war at a low simmer, Russia ensures that the U.S. remains preoccupied in the Middle East, buying Moscow the time it needs to consolidate its own regional goals elsewhere. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of a third-party variable, the role of regional powers like Pakistan and India. Both nations have been courted by Russia to support a negotiated settlement that favors a return to the status quo. These nations, however, are also feeling the immense economic pain of the energy crisis. They are caught in the middle of a struggle that is no longer just between Iran and the U.S., but between a U.S.-led order that demands containment and a Russia-Iran axis that seeks to break the isolation of the axis of resistance. Moscow is effectively using these third-party nations as cover, leveraging their desire for a quick resolution to push for a settlement that keeps the U.S. out of the region while leaving Russia's influence intact. Looking ahead, we see two primary logical scenarios. The first is a controlled de-escalation, where Russia facilitates a limited, face-saving ceasefire in exchange for secret concessions on Western sanctions or regional security guarantees, essentially selling its cooperation to the highest bidder. This would require the U.S. to tolerate a degree of Iranian military presence in exchange for a restoration of the flow of energy. The second scenario is an accidental integration, where the technical cooperation between Moscow and Tehran becomes so overt or so damaging to U.S. forces that Washington is forced to designate Russia as a direct combatant. This would trigger a massive, global escalation that removes the possibility of mediation entirely, forcing a direct confrontation between the two largest nuclear powers. The condition for the first scenario is a Russian realization that its domestic economic gains from oil are being rapidly offset by the rising risk of total diplomatic and financial isolation from the West. The condition for the second scenario is a single, catastrophic intelligence leak or a high-casualty military strike on U.S. personnel that leaves the White House with no choice but to respond to the Kremlin directly. We are also monitoring the impact of the 2026 political climate in the U.S. As the midterm elections approach, the pressure on the current administration to show a win in the Middle East is growing, potentially narrowing the window for Russia's mediated peace. We are left with the realization that Russia's role as a mediator is a strategic fiction designed to serve the harsh reality of its own national survival. By positioning itself at the very center of the negotiation, Moscow effectively buys time to harden its own economy and wait for the Western alliance to fracture under the weight of the war's duration and the resulting economic exhaustion. We are witnessing a masterclass in opportunistic geopolitics, where the goal is not to solve the underlying problem, but to manage it until the opponent is eventually drained of resources. As we look at the coming weeks of back-channel talks in St. Petersburg and the quiet, steady flow of satellite data into Iranian command centers, we are forced to ask, is Moscow acting as the bridge to a peaceful settlement, or is it merely the architect of a world where perpetual, localized conflict is the new, profitable status quo for the Kremlin?